thinking. Critical thinking. Critical thinking is a method of thinking that questions assumptions. Somebody tell me what an assumption is. Quickly.
Presupposition without a lack of evidence or basis in reality.
Sure. You look at something, you make an assumption. What did we just do with Nathan over here?
He assumed that he was a swimmer rather than a bowler because he doesn't have a big gut.
I should be the bowler, you should be the swimmer. Absolutely, that was an assumption, right? What happens when we make lots of false assumptions about people, about groups, about things, about intellect, whatever? What happens when we make too many false assumptions?
They become solidified and kind of simulate a truth.
They turn into stereotypes, right? They turn into stereotypes. Also, part of critical thinking is questioning the long-held conventions that you might have, that society might have, that anybody might have. Tell me what a convention is. And don't tell me it's the Shriners that meet in Philadelphia every year and, you know, tear the place apart. What's a convention?
An archetype or moray that is kind of presumed to be the basis on which everyone acts.
Close. What else? What would one of your own conventions be? It'd be the way you act, right? Was that just too simple? It'd be the way you act. The way you act. Why you act a particular way. What formulates the way you act? What formulates the way you think? That's a realm of convention that particularly applies to you. Conventions. Also, what we're going to do is question our sociological and cultural traditions. We have to question things. What's important about questioning things that relates directly to critical thinking? Well, it's very, very simple. If you don't know that there's a problem there, you can't fix the problem. Seems pretty reasonable to me, right? So in terms of thinking critically, we have to uncover the problem so we're able to get at the problem so we can fix the problem. If we don't fix the problem festers, and the problem becomes bigger and bigger until it gets out of control, and then we got major issues. Then it starts to affect the conventions of other people based on the assumptions that we've made about that particular issue. You follow that? Nod if you did and shake if you didn't. Yeah, it's not that hard. So what we're doing is we're thinking critically. We're trying to think about things that might be worth correcting in our society, in ourselves, in the people around us, whatever the case might be. It's thinking critically about something. Not being afraid to question those long-held assumptions, to get away from those long-held conventions. Fixing racism is a perfect example of that, right? Yesterday was Martin Luther King Jr.'s personal holiday. So the other thing that we need to think about is to question the intellectual conjecture, right? Intellectually, how does this fit? How do we as a person, how do we as a people become critical thinkers? When we're really programmed not to be critical thinkers, we're programmed to kind of become part of the mass. I was watching the inauguration yesterday, and they showed these pictures down the mall in Washington, and you couldn't see a person, right? You just saw a mass of people. A mass of people that gathered to see the inauguration. It was an incredible sight. And there are lots of people there, but the people sooner or later become a mass. And the individualism of that particular person that's standing in that mass becomes lost in the mass. So if we call this society a mass, we have a whole bunch of built-in conventions that formulate the paradigm in which the mass operates in. In other words, you're very, very used to your culture. You're very, very comfortable in your culture. Your culture is part of your comfort zone. That mass will operate within a particular comfort zone, which is kind of an intellectual conjecture of your society. It's part of your society. It's part of that paradigm, part of where we feel comfortable. And we feel comfortable, and we're going to keep feeling comfortable as long as we possibly can until somebody questions it. If that mass is oppressing another mass, then we have to think critically about whether that mass is actually doing the right thing. That's been the problem with racism over the years, for instance, right? people who've enjoyed the benefits of racism have not worried about those things that aren't benefits outside the realm of racism. Just as an example, we're not talking about racism right now, but it's a very, very good way to kind of think about this. Women, how many women here seem to do the dishes every night? Tell the truth. How many women here's mothers do the dishes every night? And not the fathers? I'm not believing you. The surveys will say about 90% of women do the dishes every night on a nightly basis in this society, right? 90% of women. If you're in a car driving with mom and dad, who's usually driving? Dad. Yeah. So that's a conjecture. Does that make the woman feel more powerful or less powerful? Certainly she's less in control. She could be to the point where she's just used to hopping in the car and being the passenger. She probably has her own car at this day and age. Most families now have more than one car. But those are part of this society's paradigm. We're set up that way, right? I'm guilty of that. I don't even mind doing dishes, but I usually don't do the dishes for some reason. I'm usually watching Big Bang Theory. But in short, yeah. Critical thinking is also about reflective thinking, focused on deciding what to believe or what to do. Reflective thinking. One of the things that I found when I hit 50, and I know you didn't believe I was 50, you thought I was probably in my late 20s. But one of the things that happened when I hit 50 was I started to get real reflective. What does reflective mean? Well, you start to think about things. I started to think about, like, I still remember dropping the football in high school when we could have went to the state tournament, right? I was a running back. We ran the ball all the time. The one time in the season when they threw it to Gary, boom, hit me in the face mask and fell on the ground. And it's like, oh, if I could just get that minute back. So I'm reflective, and I'm still kind of ticked off about it, right? You get reflective. There are whole years of my life that I can't tell you one thing I did in that year. I start to get reflective. I start to get reflective about my grandchildren. I start to get reflective about my children. Where did the time go? And you're gonna feel this. Believe me, you're gonna feel this. When you start getting in your 40s and 50s, it's gonna hit you. And it's gonna hit you like a ton of bricks. Time does not slow down, it just keeps on a-ticking. And it goes faster and faster as you get older, believe me. Reflective thinking. If you're a teacher, you go home at night and the lesson didn't go that well. You start to reflect on it. You start to think what you could do better, what you could have done to push the conversation in one way or push the conversation in another way. Maybe you just made a test for your class or something, and there were certain questions that weren't worded quite right, that kind of thing. Reflective thinking. Thinking at a deeper level. Thinking about what you're thinking about. If you're able to do that, you're able to reach this next level of intellectual thought. Reflective thinking. Very, very important that you start thinking about reflective thinking. All teachers should be reflective. It's part of the creed at USD. You should be able to think reflectively. Reflective thinking. Yes. Oh, you have a question? Who here thinks that they think reflectively?
Just certain things that do at work. I work at movie theaters and I'm assistant manager, so some things get people to actually do some things. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
So,
If you manage people,
yeah.
you have to think reflectively. Thinking about what you're thinking about. Right now, what are you thinking about? Why the hell are we doing this lecture, right? What is this critical thinking thing about? Why does this have anything to do with Indian issues? Why is this part of our course? If you're thinking about that right now, if you're thinking about why we're talking about critical thinking, think about why you're thinking about why we're talking about critical thinking. Think about why you're thinking about that. Or is dissonance rising? Do you feel any level of dissonance? What's dissonance, by the way? We're going to be talking a lot about dissonance. What's dissonance? Take a stab at it. You're teachers. You're supposed to be vocal. Express your opinion. What's dissonance? Clashing, contrast, that's all part of it. What dissonance is, if I tell you to do something that goes against what you want to do, that dissonance comes then, right? Because you're being forced to do something you don't want to do, but you still have to do it. So that's what dissonance is. Dissonance is that feeling about having to do it. So is this conversation raising dissonance in you? Can you tell if you're having a different level of dissonance? Are you rejecting the lecture? Are you falling asleep? Is it you think it's going over your head, but you're afraid to say, Mr. Cheeseman, will you please back up and talk about this? Those kinds of things. All of those things have a tendency to raise the dissonance levels. If I'm talking about race in America, dissonance levels tend to go way up. So critical in this context does not mean disapproval or negative. In fact, it means something very, very positive. A lot of times when I'm out at different places doing lectures, and it happens almost, I'd say half of the time, somebody in the audience is saying, or thinking, or saying, or whatever, Mr. Cheeseman, why are you so angry? Why don't you just calm down? We'll be more receptive if you're not angry at us, right? And it's like, oh man, angry? I haven't been angry in 20 years. There's a difference between passion and anger. Sometimes, if you're not willing to accept the passion of somebody, you'll label it anger, right? And dismiss it. It's an easy way to dismiss it because we think about anger as a bad thing all the time, even though anger can be a very, very good emotion for you. You get angered at something, you might be more apt to do something about it. If you get very, very angry, you might be able to think more critically about something. Something really ticks you off. Maybe South Dakota passes a law that says you can kick your dog once a day. I mean, that's going to tick most people in here off. Unless you're Michael Vick, you're going to be really ticked off, right? Kicking your dog? Why would we pass a law that says you can kick your dog? Who are these pinheads in Pierre? That kind of thing, right? However, that dissonance that you feel, that anger that you feel, might provoke you to do something. You might be in Pierre the next day going, oh no, we're not going to do this. How did we get to this point? What's the discussion about? All that kind of stuff. So anger is not always necessarily a bad thing. Now, if a man's coming home, he's angered at his wife and things happen, physical violence, stuff like that, it's a bad thing. But if it inspires you to do good, then anger is not such a bad thing. There's many times in my life I've been angry enough to actually do something, to take action, to get on the phone and call people, to organize for resistance, that kind of thing. Formulating an effective practical solution to a complex personal problem or issue. That might take the need to think critically, right? You might need to start thinking critically in order to accomplish that goal. Figuring out what course of action to take. That's going to take thinking critically. You're going to have to analyze the problem, uncover the issues in the problem, and start to figure out ways to address the problem. As teachers, when you have problem children in your classes, you're going to have to get critical about this. You're going to have to figure out what the problem is. Look at the signs, look at the symptoms. Maybe there's issues going on at home. Maybe this person's going out to the playground or the wherever and getting bullied. Maybe you're seeing the signs. So that's going to take some critical analysis. You're going to have to make the right decision as a teacher to get to the bottom of that situation, right? Analyzing the assumptions and practices used in aiming at a given premise. So, what we said earlier, if there's assumptions out there, assumptions that aren't true, it's going to take a level of critical thinking to prove them true or to prove what the assumptions are to be untrue, right? What if the assumptions are about a lesson plan? What if the assumption is that Columbus sailed to the Americas and he was this great discoverer of everything? We're going to be talking about Columbus down the road. But now everybody knows that wasn't true. Well, not everybody does, because the last class where we showed the whole Columbus thing, half of the students went, I never heard that before. So, we'll see what you say when the time comes. We'll see how much dissonance that raises, because in your high school classes, in your whole K-12 system, you didn't learn about Columbus accurately. You learned about him as being a hero, some kind of heroic figure who sailed over here and discovered America, right? You didn't hear the rest of the story. So critical thinking will mean uncovering the rest of the story, giving us a perspective that's historically accurate, for instance. So if you're going to be history teachers, you have to start thinking about those kinds of historical accuracies. If you're going to be a teacher of any kind, your information actually has to be fairly accurate all the time. You have to think critically about your lesson plans. give both sides of the issue, all that kind of thing. The list of core critical thinking skills include observation. Right now, you're kind of in a state of observation. I'm not asking you to take notes, I'm not asking you to do that, anything like that. I'm asking you to observe what's going on, right? You're watching the lecture, you're trying to take in what you can using your own way of remembering. That goes back to that class where we remember the names, right? You're trying to put things together. You're trying right now to remember what you learned in the past so you can attach what's coming up right now to it. Because that's already solidified. That's the number one way, by the way, in which people learn. You attach new information to information that you have. So if the information that you have is not accurate, you're going to be experiencing some dissonance. How does this fit? When I tell you that Columbus was a murderous kind of moron, according to the people on his ship, those diaries, then what are you going to be thinking after never hearing that before? Why? I mean, it's there, right? It's all there. So critically thinking and critically thinking about it might be going out, getting that information and solidifying it with what you already know. Well, I heard this side of the story, but what about this side of the story? Very, very important that we start thinking about it. Okay, think about or refutable because it is logically possible or rationally plausible for a frog to be another color. We know that. So as you're thinking about information, as you're thinking about what you know, you also have to start thinking about what you know as being not necessarily true or plausibly incorrect. That's critical thinking. That's not taking everything that's told to you at face value. That's thinking critically. If somebody tells you something, something in the back of your mind as a scholar, as an academic, as a teacher, something in the back of your mind should be triggered, and you should be thinking, well, that might or might not be true. If you're teaching some kind of subject matter in a classroom, and just because it says it in the history books, by the way, a study that came out a couple years ago and has been confirmed and reconfirmed and reconfirmed and reconfirmed over and over again, says that probably the most inaccurate document in this country are our country's text history books in the K-12 system. Based on what's left out and based on how it's presented to people. So with that little bit of information, a lot of you should be feeling some dissonance right now. Well, I went through history. How can they teach you the wrong stuff, right? What do you mean? It said this, it didn't say that, and on and on and on and on and on. That's kind of disturbing to me, by the way. Knowing that most of what we were taught is inaccurate is kind of problematic. One of the things that we're going to try to do in this class is to get you to think critically enough to go outside the realm of your own lens. To think about the situations, the scenarios, and the stories in this class from a different perspective. To take yourself and set your own conventions aside, take on the conventions of a different culture, of a different society, whatever it might be, and use those to evaluate the situation in front of you. We're going to be doing that this entire semester. You're going to have approximately 9 kind of full-length stories to kind of evaluate this from. You're going to have all kinds of digressions. One of the things that I do in this class is I digress a lot, and I do that on purpose. If I'm painting a picture out here, and all of a sudden there's something else that pertains to that picture being more accurate, we'll take that road a while. That's very, very important, and a very important part of storytelling. What I'm trying to help you do, and what I'm trying to help you come to realize, is that just because we live in South Dakota doesn't mean that South Dakota is the only thing out there. And just because we grew up in a culture that's very, very conducive to our own comfort zones, generation after generation after generation, and this culture solidifies our assumptions about our own comfort zones and the comfort zones of somebody else, doesn't mean that we necessarily have to view society and the cultures around us that way. Because everything's changing, everything's in flux. And it will continue to change. We're not going backwards. And for teachers to be great teachers, we have to recognize the fact that we, as teachers, have to change. The only constant in the world is change. Every time that clock ticks, every second that passes, we change. You came into this class one way, you're going to leave this class today another way. One of the reasons why we started out with that piece of music is because we haven't played a piece of music before. It tied into the class last time, and it tied the two classes together, right? It's very, very interesting. Interesting to bring the subject of pop culture into this realm. Pop culture is a synonym for white culture. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. What we see on TV is very, very much the culture in which we live in. It has to be, because the reason the shows are popular is because your conventions match the conventions of the TV shows. When you analyze the TV shows, as Dr. Youngbauer often does in his media analysis, when you analyze the TV shows, they're a direct reflection of our own personal conventions and our own belief systems. Which is interesting when you really look at what's on TV. With all the, like, the reality shows and, what's that baby show? What's that, Poor Baby?
Here Comes Honey Boo Boo.
Yeah. When you look at, on Friday nights, they have this show called Wipeout, right? Have you ever seen that show? It's kind of funny to watch. But when you think about how they're being tossed around on that show and stuff, it's like, what am I laughing at here? Right? It's very, very interesting to think about. Think about the sitcoms out there right now. How are they a reflection of who we are? Why is it that TV Land and MeTV and those kinds of TV programs and those kinds of TV stations are so popular? Well, they're reflective. They come to people like me, whose my prime time was the early 1970s, late 1960s, right? That was my time. Your time, by the way, is when you were a teenager. That's your era. My era, I'm gonna take with me the same things that were in my era. Those things are gonna follow me for the rest of my life. Your high school years are never gonna leave your noodle. That was your era. That's when you supposedly kind of went on to the next step of life. That's the music that's going to be the most familiar to you, the music that you're going to like throughout your entire life. When you're going down the road and all of a sudden you turn on the radio and something from your era pops up, you're going to smile. If something pops up from my era, you're going to go, what the hell? And you're going to turn it, right? What's this oldies stuff? Van who? Not Van Hagar. So there's all kinds of conventions that we've become very, very accustomed to. Now, folks, is the time that we need to step outside these conventions. And here's the biggest reason why. You're going to choose being a teacher throughout your entire career. So the chances are you're going to retire as a teacher probably in your 60s. By the time you get there, possibly mid to late 70s. Especially the women in here who aren't going to have a problem living that long. But your students are still going to be high school students. So you know what's happening. This stays the same as you start nearing the end. So, back to square one. You go full circle. We need to start opening up our minds. We need to start thinking critically so we can solve the problems that are in front of us. We need to start thinking critically so we can understand our objectives in our career. We need to start thinking critically so we can start teaching the next generation how to think critically so they can solve the problems. Critical thinking is a very, very important aspect of our lives. And from this point on in here, every assignment that you do, you should be thinking about that assignment critically. What about this assignment should be helping us think critically? All of those topics that you have, all of those subjects have two sides to the story. Doesn't necessarily mean bad or good, it just means two different lenses. And both lenses could be good. I mean, if you're talking about a banana, if the objective is do you eat a banana the way it is or do you put it in a banana split, yeah, both are good for me.